Hey guys, Pat Ryarchy here, also known as the Patriarchy. All hail the Patriarchy, well into 2017. So here's a shit article from Salon. I mean, this is one of the worst articles I've seen in a long time by Amanda Marcotti. I think it's Marcotti, not sure. But, against Sergeant Pepper, the Beatles' classic made pop seem male, nerdy, and important, and that wasn't a good thing. The Beatles' most legendary record, now turning 50, marked the moment when pop became serious fare for serious guys. Now, I'm going to go to the article a little bit here, but basically her argument in the article is that the Beatles were not taken seriously, and rock and roll and all that wasn't taken seriously in the 60s, and their previous albums weren't serious because they had such a huge following of girls, and it was considered silly and stupid when all the girls loved them. Then she says that once they did Sgt. Pepper's, they were taken seriously because male music critics were able to take them seriously now, and once men accepted rock music, then it was cool. And she also tries to say that women were the benchmark of music taste before men. She says that women liked the Beatles more before men did, and it took a while for it to catch on. Women liked disco before men did. She tried to claim that all disco belonged to women and gay men, which led to EDM and hip-hop and that. So she's basically saying through this article that women liked all good music before men did. She also has this weird point about teeny boppers, that she feels bad for these women that love this music and overreacted because, you know, they had lust, they had this hidden lust, and they were being, very sexual and kind of, I mean, crazy. You see those reactions, how the girls acted to the Beatles. They would faint and stuff. But this is one of the most off-base articles I've read in a long time in the fact, and it's getting shit on everywhere. Like, the comments are, like, insanely negative. I mean, no feminist is liking this article. It's pretty much being shit on everywhere because she doesn't source a lot of the things she says. She seems way too young and to be talking about this stuff, and she has no knowledge in music history. She just ignores stuff. She ignores that Rubber Soul and Revolver came out before Sgt. Pepper's and were both very acclaimed by critics, and that Pet Sounds came out before Sgt. Pepper's was acclaimed by critics. And didn't sell that well, actually. And Sgt. Pepper's was a response to Pet Sounds because Paul McCartney was so impressed with what Brian Wilson was doing, and they were just trying to evolve their music. She seems to think that rock wasn't taken seriously until that moment at Sgt. Pepper's, but that's just not true. The culture and curve was already turning well before that. Now, I'm all for criticizing music journalists back in the day. You go back and look at Rolling Stone reviews of Led Zeppelin albums back in the day, and they just give them shit reviews. Or classic albums, they'll give like 2 or 2 stars, you know, and now they give them 5. A famous one, Nirvana, Nevermind, they give that album a 3-star review. Now they rank it as one of the 20 greatest albums of all time. But the stuff she's talking about, it's just not sourced and true. You could debunk a lot of this, and it's clearly her ideology, her feminist ideology, which I know some people try to argue, well, she's writing from a feminist lens. That's unfortunately, when you're trying to give us a new perspective on something, a new point of view, you have to actually, like, really be insightful and do your research on it. You can't just make shit up, basically. It's like she just read some stuff or heard this stuff from... I mean, like I said, she seems to have a very limited taste or understanding of music, just from this article. I don't know outside of that, because I don't know this woman. For those who find Rolling Stone, the tiresome, how they rank things, because they always do their list... but Sgt. Pepper's came out, it was 50 years old. Men who love rock music got really competitive, trying to outdo each other with their lofty prose, exalting the greatness of the seminal album. So she's mad because a bunch of men were writing articles about praising this album on its 50th anniversary release, which is getting very acclaimed and praised across the board for its sounds and everything it's doing. Calling it the best album ever, William Goldman of Billboard wrote, Sgt. Pepper's became a crossroads for the band and the world. Mikhail Gilmore of Rolling Stone called the album a central touchstone for the 1960s and an exemplar for a generation that was forging new ideals. Sgt. Pepper's, you see, is the album that marked the shift in rock music away from the grubby fingers of the teeny bopper crowd and to the hushed halls of great art. It was the transition album that turned rock from a debased music for ponytails fans twisting the night away to music for grown men whose tastes are far too refined to worry about whether a pop song has a beat you could dance to. Sgt. Pepper's was the point when rock stopped being the music of girls and started being the music of men. And that's just not really true. Also, men and women were sharing the rock scene of music together. You seem to not understand the 60s and 70s, the people and the culture shift at the time. And I know she's trying to focus on the critics, but she seems to be understanding the context of Sgt. Pepper's was a seminal album for both men and women who followed the bands and saw this evolution that led to Led Zeppelin and Pink Floyd and all those hit songs and stuff like that. There was a change in the world. Woodstock had men and women. Men and women were learning about sexuality, free love, sleeping with different kinds of people, being more accepting of homosexuals and stuff like that, trying to fight racial barriers. It was all sorts of things, and the music encapsulated that for a lot of people. It wasn't that it was a shift from teeny bopper girls and non-serious music, but you have to be fair here. The early Beatles music that I adore, the pop music, as I'm a huge Beatles fan. There's probably 6, 7 posters in my room right now dedicated to the Beatles. I love Please Please Me and Hard Day's Night. I think those are wonderful albums. But, they evolved. Every Beatles album is an evolution through the time, and Rubber Soul and Revolver was already that evolution. She also goes on to call both albums pretentious, which I completely disagree with, because pretension would say that the Beatles were trying to pretend they were something they were not. I don't think they were pretending anything. I think John Lennon was a troll early on, and he's very much said a lot of his songs are meaningless and written to be a troll, which is kind of the opposite of being pretentious. He, didn't give a fuck. And Paul McCartney's one of the least pretentious songwriters of all time, in my opinion. I think Paul McCartney is clearly a self-aware writer. There's nothing pretentious about her tracks. But this is basically like, oh, look, I'm being a contrarian. I don't love Sgt. Pepper. And my reasoning is because men get to praise it, and it took the power away from women. Because for some reason, women don't appreciate music like Sgt. Pepper's, or even though all the girls I know like the Beatles, like all of their music, they don't just like the early shit. I don't know what the fuck she's talking about. Okay, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band was the album that made it possible and intelligible for people to say that rock and roll album had changed music. That was already said in Pet Sounds when Beach Boys came out. Writes Jack Hamilton for Slate, explaining why this album tends to rate above all others in the annals of pop music. Well, I think a lot of it was just that the production, the singing, the evolution of their sound from what they were doing before, the ambition. I think they wrote their best song on that album. A Day in the Life, I think, is the greatest Beatles song of all time, and it's on the net. It's an incredible piece of music. You could see that John and Paul were really going places as songwriters, and especially Paul with his ear. It was where music was going. It's some of the greatest stuff. You're just ignoring all that. But during all the celebration, I'd like to take time to pour one out for teeny boppers, who always get there first and all too rarely get credit for it. In fact, the fate of the teeny bopper is to watch her music get sneered at right up until it gets taken away and turned to a respectable art form that is okay for grown men to like. Yeah, when the Beatles were on Ed Sullivan and it was the most watched moment in television, and the girls they were celebrating, that was mocked and not respect. That's one of the most significant moments in all of television. What are you talking about? The Beatles were a phenomenon. They were huge. I mean, it was a major thing. The fuck are you going on about? It wasn't exclusive to girls. That's just a fucking bullshit thing they talk about because it was one of the early times girls wanted to fuck guys in music, and that's still rampant today that women like musicians they want to fuck. That hasn't changed, and that was one of the first. But Elvis was doing that way before. And you're saying Elvis wasn't respected? Elvis was highly respected and influenced a lot of people that went on to do music. Once again, did you not know about anything about music previous to Sgt. Pepper's? The Beatles, of course, are the most iconic example of this trajectory. When the quartet from Liverpool started releasing albums, their fans were mostly teenage girls who were frequently mocked for their hysterical outpouring of enthusiasm that clearly was an uncorking of repressed lust. Well, the reason it was hysterical, they were mocked, it's just because it's funny. You watch it now and it's funny. There's these chicks that are just passing out. My dad went to go see Hard Day's Night in the theater, and girls were passing out in the theater while the movie was on. They passed out in the theater. That's ridiculous. That's just silly. Girls liked the Beatles because they wanted to fuck the Beatles, or so the theory went. Well, I mean, have you seen them? George Harrison was a good-looking fucking dude. I want to fuck that guy. And the whole thing was kind of embarrassing, even for the men of the center of the enterprise who were getting rich and famous of all that female desire. Yeah, it had nothing to do with that great, the great harmonies and catchy music or all that, or the way they looked or anything. It was all... It's no surprise, then, as the Beatles shift towards a more respectable and artistic branding meant shedding their sex appeal. She's saying that they took their sex appeal away with the goofy-looking uniforms that couldn't be better suited to repel the female gaze. So she's saying women didn't want to fuck the Beatles when they came out with Sgt. Pepper's. Once again, no proof of this, as every woman I've talked to that was alive then that liked the Beatles had no problem with Sgt. Pepper. She seems to forget that mustaches and weird outfits, it was the 60s. And the Beatles did not lose. I mean, I think John Lennon wasn't as good looking as he was when he was a younger guy, but are you saying George Harrison and them lost sex appeal? I've never heard that said. The cover to Abbey Road with them having the long hair and stuff like that, I didn't know women thought that was unattractive. Where is she getting? You may not find it attractive because you're younger, so you don't have a context for the time. But she seems to think the Beatles were intentionally trying to be nerdy and goofy so they could leave their sex appeal image behind, even though the Sgt. Pepper's costumes and stuff is part of the whole thing. It's part of the concept of the album, and it was them wanting to take their music a little bit more seriously to have more themes behind it. They didn't just want to be a marketing gimmick. Anyway, Sgt. Pepper is a good pop record, don't get me wrong. Oh, wow, thanks. Glad you think it's a good pop record. But it's a record I resent because it helps cement the notion that music for girls is silly and music for men is artistically significant. What notion is that? That's a notion I don't know of because women like tons of popular acclaimed music, same as men do. It's a notion that is doubly appalling because history shows time and again that girls' tastes are the ones that are ahead of the curve. And she brings up disco, classic girl music, or more accurately, music for girls and gay men. Everyone went to disco clubs and danced to do cocaine and fuck each other. And there was a huge movie, one of my favorite films of all time, Saturday Night Fever. It made like $250 million and perpetuated the disco scene that actually wasn't that big as the movie made it out to be. And the Bee Gees record made it big. Disco was kind of a myth that was kind of created. I love disco, and I'm a fan of it, but it got shitty real fast, and later disco really turned to crap. It was only good for a little while. But she brings up the disco demolition night at Chicago where they burned the disco records. And it used to be that rock versus pop music thing. Rock sucks. And we don't quite live in that same world today. And that's a fair point you could make in the article, but she doesn't make that point. Her point's more about sexism with men and women in the music industry and music history, which is bad. I wish she was instead talking about the competitiveness people had with genres that's still rampant. But instead, this article just comes off like somebody whining that Sgt. Pepper's is popular and they don't agree with it. Which, who gives a fuck what people think about the album? You don't have to agree with it. But disco is also the backbone of every prestigious musical form that was invented after it. Hip-hop is built on disco samples. All that electronic dance music EDM that white dudes love these days, ripped off disco. EDM in its various forms can be kind of dumb and bro-ish or intricate and nerdy, but it's largely seen as masculine. Really? I don't agree with that. I don't think most people see EDM as a masculine thing at all, actually. It's kind of I mean, I don't. It's DJs and stuff, they're like, what? And its audience consisted of ladies or gay guys who enjoy dressing up and having fun on the dance floor. And doing cocaine. Lots and lots of cocaine. It's a process that's been a cycle through at other times. Grunge was seen by many, including music critics, as a redemptive music in the 90s because it bounced girly pop songs from the likes of Madonna, Duran Duran, and Michael Jackson off the chart. Well, Michael Jackson was highly loved. What are you talking about, Bat? Michael Jackson had rock in his albums. Dirty Diana and stuff? Michael Jackson had plenty of rock and metal influence in his albums, so that's not true. And those were huge albums. You think women are the only people that bought Thriller? It's the highest-selling album of all time, you idiot. Madonna was very acclaimed. And, yeah, Duran Duran's a little silly. I like them, but I think people were more happy that we were done with hair metal bullshit like Poison and guys who looked like girls and were singing the same fucking ballads and songs over and over again and just stripping music down. You're also excluding that Guns N' Roses came out before grunge and was very popular with Axl and Slash and that because they were more rock centered than they were, and they were heavy, Welcome to the Jungle. And then we got into grunge, which was already developing and some bands already had to sound like the Pixies were already having new sounds in the 80s. It was just the music scene changed, and it was influential because it was a change from the mainstream into something that was more unique and idiosyncratic of the artist. And it wasn't just these really lame ballads all the time and generic radio hits is what the 80s became. Because the 80s had a lot of great stuff in it, like the Talking Heads. But music was losing a lot of its soul in the process. One of the reasons I'm such a fan of early American punk bands like the Ramones and Blondie is that they explicitly tried to recapture the girlishness of 1960s rock and pop before the self-importance of albums like Sgt. Pepper's took over. Sgt. Pepper's isn't self-important. Oh my god, are you crazy? Have you ever listened to Sgt. There's nothing self. I think she misinterpreted the whole album. I don't think anything is self-important about that. That's ridiculous. So that means she has a problem with the whole David Bowie, Todd Rundgren, The Who, Pink Floyd, serious artistic album scene of music. She likes it when it just went back to goofiness. Don't get me wrong, I love that era too of Ramones and Blondie and those songs that were going back to a 50s, 60s sound. I think that stuff's great too, but that really means nothing. I mean, it's an arbitrary point to bring up. It's not. That's just you talking about your taste in music. But even punk eventually succumbed to that same logic that manliness equals credibility and requires hard or difficult pop music, and drifted away from the early 60s style sunniness of the Ramones to the brutish sounds of hardcore. You don't know the history of punk rock. Are you forgetting about the Stooges and Iggy Pop, who were not that way, that were forefathers of punk? Once again, this woman seems to have a limited understanding of music. Like, you don't get punk at all if you think the origins of punk were that. Punk was always... The good news is that girl music won in the end. The same kind of music snobs who mocked girls for loving Duran Duran in the 80s now put Rio on hip-hop best of the 80s list, such as the one at Pitchfork. Yeah, because Pitchfork's just an amazing establishment. Disco isn't shameful taste anymore, and the most... Yeah, because, disco was just hated by everyone. It wasn't this huge cultural phenomenon. And the most girlish pop disco form of EDM house music is making a comeback. Phil Spector's early 60s girl group music is distinguished as the Beatles are now. The soundtrack to both Guardians of the Galaxy movies, made up of pop classics by artists like Fleetwood Mac and the Jackson 5, are darlings not just of audiences but critics as well. Wait, so she's acting like that women started the whole Jackson 5 Fleetwood Mac thing, and women were in there early on? That's just not true. That's so... What the Oh my god, this is what a terrible article. Calling someone a rockist, i.e. someone who believes that many rock music is inherently superior to bubblegum, is now an insult. I get called a dad rocker all the time. It's just shit people say, who cares? People are really bitchy about music. If you talk to anyone who's a music person, they can be a real elitist asshole, including myself. Contemporary pop artists who might once have been shrugged off as disposable crap like Taylor Swift or Beyonce now get treated with respect by the music press. Yeah, because they're the biggest musicians in the world. Do you think Carole King wasn't taken seriously when she wrote really great music? Like Tapestry and stuff? I mean, are you joking? It's just a different era of music. We like generic pop radio music now. Back then, you had to be a really good artist to break through a lot of the time. So now, 50 years on, it's easier to evaluate Sgt. Pepper's on its own. Oh yeah, now that we have the context, she gets to look at it for the album. It really is. Free of decades of weight assigned it for supposedly saving rock music from its female fan base, even though that's not what anyone said. She made that... No one said at all that it saved music from its female fan base. And it's fine. It's not the best Beatles album. I actually agree with that. I think their best album is... I'd probably say Revolver, Rubber Soul, and the White Album are my favorite Beatles. I mean, Abbey Road's better produced and put together than the White Album, because the White Album has a bunch of filler tracks that should be cut, but the good parts of the White Album are fucking amazing. But Abbey Road's their best put together album in my opinion, but I think Revolver and Rubber Soul were wonderful evolutions of sound, and I think if you listen today, it's just groundbreaking. I'm also a huge Magical Mystery Tour fan. I actually think it holds up better than Sgt. Pepper's in a lot of ways from track to track. But Sgt. Pepper is still a masterpiece. We're talking about the Beatles here. They had a bunch of great albums. It's stupid to compare them. It's preference. Anyway, it's the similarly pretentious Revolver. Now Revolver's pretentious. Is much better. How is Revolver pretentious? Songs I remember on your Revolver are not pretentious at all. Oh my god. What? Do you know what pretentious means? This whole article's pretentious, and she's just throwing it out there. It has some moments of true transcendence, especially with the closing track, A Day in the Life. Yes, that's an amazing song. Some of it, like She's Leaving Home, is forgettable. What? She's Leaving Home's amazing. That song's terrific because it's about parents not dealing with the fact that their daughter's leaving right? It has two points of view. The point of view of the daughter, when you're a younger person listening to it, Penn Jillette actually talked about this beautifully, and he's not even a big Beatles fan, but it's about the daughter leaving in a rebellious, like, protest to her parents, like, I'm going away, fuck you, you don't understand me. But then when you get older with the age of perspective, you relate to the parents who are so heartbroken that their daughter's leaving. But the song has a sense of humor about that too, the silliness of the situation. Like how, like we gave her everything. The parents are being over melodramatic. That's a brilliant song with a lot of lyrical and thematic depth because it's about perspectives and the emotional complexities that were going on with families at the time, children and their daughters and stuff like that, or their sons, and how they were leaving or feeling this disconnect from their parents in another generation. She's Leaving Home is about that feeling in that moment when it's going on. It's a B plus record. It's no Dare by Human League, that's for sure. What? I love Dare by Human League. That's one of my favorite albums of all time. Oh wait, is she saying it's a B minus record? Never mind. A B plus, never mind. I mean, it's Dare by the Human League is definitely is a great album. It's a masterpiece, but most music critics agree with that. I'd give Dare. I'm a big New Order fan. I love a lot of. I'm a huge fan of basically a lot of shoegaze and stuff like that. My Bloody Valentine. But what the fuck are you talking about? You just get to say that Sgt. Pepper's a B plus record? Why? You didn't really give a good review why it's a B plus. If your only thing is She's Leaving Home is forgettable, why is it forgettable? I just explained to you why it's an interesting song. Are you saying A Little Help from My Friends is a forgettable song? Fixing a Hole? Those are all great songs. Now, I think Magical Mystery Tour is better, track to track, but it's kind of hard to act like Sgt. Pepper's isn't an incredible album. I mean, a lot of it is the sound and the production. The production is fucking phenomenal. She doesn't even bring that element up because I guess it doesn't matter to her. But part of me will always begrudge the record its reputation because it helped lead to a world where certain kinds of pop music was treated as inferior for decades just because its fan base were mostly people who looked like me. That's just not true. You made that whole story up that people were sexist about it. It's just that music changed organically. Had you sourced and made better points that I couldn't easily debunk with just a basic understanding of music history, you might have had something, but you didn't source this at all. This is shit. Let's go a little further. One of my favorite bands of all time, Big Star. Huge fan. Their first album, #1 album, only sold 10,000 copies. They never really got successful, yet they influenced everyone. And then they became famous later on because their songs were used in that '70s show, and the opening theme was a cover of their original song, Down the Street, Hanging Out. They did all that music, and 13 and all that. Now they're a really famous, respected band. They were really I mean, #1 album is one of the most critically acclaimed albums of all time, and they had a big Beatles influence, but it took years for people to discover them. That's not because men and women didn't find them, it's just people didn't know about them, and it took a long time. At the end of the day, it's all about taste, and the audience dictates what people like or not like. What sells and influences the people is what mattered. Your whole argument about it being a man-woman thing is just off base because that wasn't what music was to a lot of people. That wasn't the center of it. There was so much more to it. There were so many more variables. You'd have to break down every single one of them. But you focus on one aspect because that's the guys that you want to see it on there, which is complete bullshit. Amanda Marcotti. And here, I wanted to go read her original article because I wanted to make sure I wasn't getting it wrong. Because I originally found out this from the Heat Street article that was talking about it. But yeah, she wrote 1,200 words. People who look like me. Actually, a lot of those girls were really hot. You look kind of like a dude. Oh, that's right. I'm mean. I don't give a fuck. It is always feminists that aren't the hottest chicks that are bitching about this stuff. It's like, oh, so because you're not a 10 and guys don't want to kiss your ass, then it's music for you because you don't like music. Like, she seems to live in this bubble where she thinks that people don't like the same music that she does because she's a woman, and that's how people have this context of music history. There's a lot of people shitting on her, though. My God, Salon, do you actually try to use your own website? Shut up, Amanda Marcotti, and please go away forever. The feminist cultural critic argues women don't make or appreciate complex, challenging, and mature pop music. That basically was the premise of the article. And I get it. She was trying to say that it was taken seriously because men could appreciate it then because it was for them. But quite simply, that's just not true. It was always made for everyone, and men and women liked it together, and it just caught on with more and more. As John Lennon once said, I thought we were the greatest band in the world. It just took a while for everyone else to catch on. And we're bigger than Jesus Christ, was another thing John Lennon said. Anyways, the patriarchy. Like, comment, and subscribe. Give me your opinion in the comment section. And what's your favorite Beatles album? I'm interested in, even if you're not a fan or whatnot, what's your favorite album? And what do you think about Amanda's brilliant writing abilities?